The Galactic Military Academy floated in the void like a chrome tumor with delusions of grandeur, and Zara Knox was starting to wonder if her acceptance letter had been some kind of cosmic practical joke. She stood at attention in Formation Hall, surrounded by 300 of the galaxy's finest future officers. Well, 299 of the galaxy's finest, plus one human who was apparently there for comic relief. Commander Vex, a 7-foot-tall crystalline, whose body looked like someone had bedazzled a praying mantis, clicked across the polished floor on legs that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. His voice resonated through the chamber with all the warmth of an IRS audit. Cadets, tomorrow you face your final examination. The Apex Training Vault will test everything you have learned about survival, strategy, and sacrifice. Behind him, Professor Gorth's tentacles writhed in what passed for approval among his species. The tentacled scholar had 17 PhDs and the personality of wet cardboard, which somehow made him the Academy's most popular instructor. Captain Reek, meanwhile, buzzed nervously in the corner, his insectoid paranoia making him constantly scan the room for threats that existed only in his compound eyes. Zara had been putting up with this circus for 3 years. 3 years of being called cute. 3 years of professors explaining basic concepts to her like she was a particularly clever pet. 3 years of other cadets asking if humans really ate their own young and lived in caves. The worst part? She was consistently in the top 5% of her class, but everyone attributed it to beginner's luck or primitive cunning. The vault contains our most advanced training simulations, Commander Vex continued, his crystalline form refracting the overhead lights into nauseating rainbows. Apex predators from across the galaxy, designed to push you beyond your limits. Cadet Blixron, a purple blob with delusions of tactical genius, leaned over to whisper, "Think the little human will last 10 minutes?" His buddy, a scaled creature whose name Zara couldn't pronounce and frankly didn't care to learn, chuckled. "I give her 5. Humans are adorable, but they're practically still using rocks and sticks." Zara's jaw tightened. She'd heard variations of this conversation roughly 6,000 times since arriving at the Academy. Apparently, the fact that humans had only achieved faster than light travel 2 centuries ago made them the galactic equivalent of toddlers playing with safety scissors. Never mind that those same toddlers had conquered every apex predator on their home planet and turned them into pets, entertainment, or dinner. Professor Gorth's translator crackled to life. The simulation difficulty adjusts based on species capabilities. Do not worry, Cadet Knox. Your program will be appropriately simplified. That did it. Zara stepped forward, her boots echoing in the sudden silence. "Sir, I'd like to request the standard difficulty setting." Commander Vex's crystalline head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. "Cadet Knox, your species profile indicates that we're primitive, yes, sir. I've heard." Zara's smile could have cut glass. "But I didn't come here to play on easy mode." The hall erupted in what various species called laughter. Captain Reek's buzzing reached a pitch that threatened to shatter nearby crystalware. Commander Vex raised a hand for silence. "Very well, Cadet Knox. Standard difficulty it is." His tone suggested he was indulging a child who insisted on touching the hot stove. As the formation dispersed, Zara caught fragments of conversation in a dozen languages, most of which roughly translated to variations of "This is going to be hilarious." Tomorrow, she decided, was going to be educational, just not in the way anyone expected. Part 2. Oops. Did we mention the vault hasn't been updated since the war? The next morning, Commander Vex stood before the Apex Training Vault's reinforced entrance, looking like a disco ball having an existential crisis. The vault itself resembled a massive metallic egg that someone had dropped from orbit and decided to leave where it landed. "Cadet Knox," he announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list, "you have 24 hours to survive the simulation. Standard protocols apply." Professor Gorth's tentacles wiggled in what Zara had learned meant barely suppressed glee. "Remember, the panic button will extract you immediately. There is no shame in admitting human limitations." Behind them, roughly half the Academy had gathered to watch what everyone assumed would be a brief but entertaining show. Betting pools had formed overnight. The longest odds were on Zara lasting 6 hours, and that bet was considered wildly optimistic. Captain Reek buzzed closer, his compound eyes reflecting Zara's image dozens of times. The simulations are completely safe, of course. Holographic projections with haptic feedback. You cannot actually be harmed. Zara nodded, stepping toward the vault entrance. Got it. Holographic. Completely safe. What none of them bothered to mention, because they'd all forgotten, was that the vault hadn't been updated since the Apex War ended 20 years ago. And during the war, they hadn't been running simulations. They'd been running live specimens. The door sealed behind Zara with a sound like a bank vault closing, which should have been her first clue. The chamber was roughly the size of a football stadium, with multiple levels connected by what looked like naturally occurring cave systems. Except they weren't natural, and they definitely weren't caves. They were hunting grounds. Zara had about 30 seconds to admire the realistic holographic foliage before something the size of a city bus stepped out from behind what she'd assumed was a decorative rock formation. The shadow beast looked exactly like its name suggested, a living shadow that had decided to hit the gym for a few millennia. Its eyes glowed like angry stars, and when it opened its mouth, Zara could see straight down to what was probably several stomachs, all of them interested in making her acquaintance. For a moment, her brain helpfully provided the same response it had given her throughout most of organic chemistry, complete and utter panic. Then the shadow beast roared, and the sound hit her like a physical force, and something deep in Zara's primitive human brain responded with a thought that would have made her ancestors proud. Oh, hell no. Outside, the faculty watched on monitors as their carefully planned lesson in humility took an unexpected turn. Is she throwing rocks at it? Professor Gorth's translator seemed confused by its own output. Indeed, Zara had found a chunk of rubble and was hurling it at the shadow beast with the accuracy of someone who'd grown up with older brothers. The rock bounced off the creature's hide, which was probably the equivalent of a mosquito bite, but the shadow beast looked genuinely offended. Primitive human tactics, Commander Vex observed, predictable, but amusing. The shadow beast lunged forward, its massive claws tearing gouges in the metal floor. Zara rolled to the side, came up running, and shouted something that the translator couldn't parse but which sounded distinctly uncomplimentary about the creature's parentage. She seems upset, Captain Reek buzzed nervously. Humans have emotional regulation issues, Professor Gorth explained sagely. She'll activate the panic button soon. They were right about one thing. Zara was upset. She was upset that she'd been treated like a mascot for 3 years. She was upset that everyone assumed she'd fold at the first sign of danger. And she was really, really upset that what was supposed to be her final exam was turning into a nature documentary titled, When Holographic Simulations Eat Students. Because it was becoming increasingly clear that the shadow beast trying to turn her into a Zara-shaped snack was significantly more solid than any hologram had a right to be. The creature cornered her near what looked like a maintenance panel. Its eyes narrowed, preparing for the final strike. Zara looked at the beast, looked at the panel, and felt that particular human emotion that had gotten her species into trouble since they'd first decided to poke things with sticks just to see what would happen. All right, you oversized night terror, she muttered, popping open the maintenance panel. Let's dance. 20 minutes later, the shadow beast was discovering that humans had some very creative ideas about what constituted a fair fight. Zara had jury-rigged the maintenance panel into what could charitably be called a weapon, though it looked more like something a mad scientist would build during a particularly vindictive coffee break. She'd connected the atmospheric recycling system to the emergency lighting grid, creating a strobe light that could induce seizures in a disco ball. The shadow beast, it turned out, was very sensitive to rapid light changes. It was currently stumbling around like a drunk teenager, roaring in confusion and possibly nausea. That's not a standard tactical response, Commander Vex observed, his crystalline form somehow managing to convey bewilderment. Professor Gorth's tentacles had stopped their usual smug writhing. The human appears to be improvising. On screen, Zara was now using improvised climbing equipment made from ventilation ducts to reach the upper levels. She'd fashioned a spear from a broken support beam and some kind of maintenance tool, and was currently stalking something that looked like a cross between a tiger and a bad decision. "Is that a vortex mauler?" Captain Reek's buzzing had reached a pitch that was making nearby equipment resonate. It was indeed a vortex mauler, and it had just noticed Zara creeping up behind it with her makeshift spear and a look of determined annoyance that would have made her third-grade teacher proud. The mauler spun around, its razor-sharp tail whipping through the air where Zara's head had been a moment before. She dropped flat, rolled under its belly, and drove her improvised spear up into what she hoped was something vital. Based on the mauler's shriek of surprise and pain, she'd guessed correctly. How did she know where to strike? Professor Gorth demanded. The answer was that Zara had spent her childhood watching nature documentaries and had absorbed the kind of practical knowledge that came from growing up on a planet where everything was constantly trying to kill you. She knew that most predators, regardless of species, kept their vulnerable bits in roughly the same place. The mauler collapsed and Zara wiped her improvised spear clean on its fur. She was breathing hard, her academy uniform was torn in 3 places, and she had what looked like alien blood on her hands. She'd never felt better in her life. Status report, she called out to the empty air, assuming someone was monitoring. 1 shadow beast neutralized, 1 vortex mauler down. What's next? Outside, the faculty exchanged glances that would have been meaningful if any of them had been paying attention to each other instead of the screens. "Sir," a technician whose species Zara had never bothered to identify called out nervously, "the vault systems are showing some irregularities." Commander Vex turned his attention from the screens. "Irregularities?" "The creatures aren't responding to simulation protocols, and the emergency override isn't functioning." There was a moment of silence that stretched until it became actively uncomfortable. "Are you telling me," Professor Gorth said slowly, his translator crackling with what might have been suppressed panic, "that the vault contains actual specimens?" Captain Reek's buzzing stopped entirely. "From the war?" Another silence, this one loaded with the kind of dread usually reserved for tax audits and surprise inspections. On screen, Zara had found what appeared to be a weapons cache and was examining a device that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd read about guns in a book but had never actually seen one. "How long until the next threat level activates?" Commander Vex asked quietly. The technician checked his instruments. "Approximately 15 minutes, sir." "And what's the next threat level?" Another pause. "The Apex King, sir." This time the silence was the kind that usually preceded evacuation orders and strongly worded letters to insurance companies. The Apex King was the vault's final boss, designed to test the absolute limits of galactic military capabilities. Even during the war, it had taken entire platoons to bring one down, and that was with military-grade weaponry and extensive tactical support. Zara, meanwhile, had figured out how the alien weapon worked and was now using it to redecorate the vault's architecture in ways that probably violated several building codes. Should we extract her?" Captain Reek asked, his voice barely audible over his nervous buzzing. They all looked at the screens, where Zara was currently carving her initials into a rock wall with alien technology, humming what sounded like a song from her homeworld. "I don't think," Commander Vex said slowly, "that she would appreciate the interruption." The Apex King emerged from the vault's deepest level, like a natural disaster with personal grievances. It stood 12 feet tall on legs that looked like they'd been carved from living shadow, with arms that could have bench-pressed a small building. Its head was crowned with spines that pulsed with their own internal light, and its eyes held the kind of ancient intelligence that had been making smaller creatures very nervous for several geological ages. Most importantly, it was absolutely, completely, 100% not a hologram. Zara looked up from where she'd been fashioning some kind of explosive device from cleaning supplies and spare electronics. Her expression was the same one she might have worn if someone had interrupted her during a particularly engaging crossword puzzle. Let me guess, she said conversationally. You're the final boss? The Apex King regarded her with the kind of attention usually reserved for interesting insects. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel mixed with broken promises. You are the human. That's what they tell me. Zara set down her improvised bomb and stretched, working out the kinks in her shoulders. Though apparently being human means I'm supposed to be impressed by oversized lizards with anger management issues. The Apex King's spines flared brighter. During the war, entire battalions had fled when confronted with that particular display. Zara yawned. Are we doing this or what? Because I've got dinner plans, and I'm pretty sure the cafeteria stopped serving that weird blue stuff at 1800 hours. Outside, the faculty had gathered additional observers. Word had spread through the academy that the human was not only still alive, but was apparently trash-talking the galaxy's most feared predator like it was a mildly annoying telemarketer. She cannot be serious, Professor Gorth whispered, though his translator made it sound like a shout. The Apex King moved with the fluid grace of something that had perfected the art of murder across several star systems. Its first swipe should have separated Zara's head from her shoulders. Instead, it caught empty air as Zara rolled between its legs and came up behind it, already swinging her improvised spear toward what she hoped was a kidney. The king spun faster than something that size had any right to move, catching her weapon in one massive hand and crushing it to splinters. Primitive, it rumbled. Yeah, well, Zara panted, backing away and pulling out her improvised explosive. Primitive works. She triggered the device and dove for cover as a significant portion of the vault's upper level decided to become one with the lower level, in a very loud and destructive way. When the smoke cleared, the Apex King was still standing, though it looked considerably more irritated than before. Several of its spines had been snapped off, and there was a distinctly predatory gleam in its eyes. Now you die, little human. Zara wiped debris from her face and grinned with the kind of expression that had made saber-toothed tigers reconsider their life choices. You know what your problem is? She said, circling the creature like she was giving a lecture. You're used to fighting civilized species that follow rules and fight fair, and surrender when things get tough. The king lunged again, its claws tearing through the air with enough force to shred steel. Zara wasn't there. But humans, she continued from her new position, somehow having gotten behind it again. Humans are the species that looked at wolves and said, I bet I can make those friendly. We're the species that saw sharks and decided they'd look better as soup. She'd found another weapon, this one looking like it had been designed by someone with a very pessimistic view of conflict resolution. We're the species that turned every predator on our planet into either a pet, a meal, or a tourist attraction. The weapon hummed to life in her hands. And buddy, you just made the mistake of thinking you could intimidate something that evolved alongside creatures specifically designed to eat us. The Apex King paused, something that might have been uncertainty flickering across its features. Zara's grin widened. Welcome to Earth biology, you overgrown gecko. What followed was less a fight and more a masterclass in creative violence. Zara used every dirty trick, improvised weapon, and environmental hazard she could find. She turned the vault's own systems against the king, using everything from atmospheric controls to artificial gravity to make the creature's life increasingly difficult. The king, for its part, was learning that there was a significant difference between fighting trained soldiers and fighting something that had grown up considering apex predators a fun weekend challenge. When it was over, and the dust had settled, Zara stood over the king's massive form, breathing hard but victorious. She looked up at where she assumed the cameras were located. Exam complete, she called out. Can someone open the door? I'm starving, and if I have to eat alien rations for dinner, someone's getting a very strongly worded complaint. The vault door opened with a sound like the universe clearing its throat, and Zara emerged dragging the Apex King's head by one of its broken spines. The assembled crowd of faculty and students had been expecting many things. They'd been prepared for a traumatized human who would need counseling, sedatives, and possibly a complete memory wipe. They'd been ready for a quick extraction of what remained after the Apex King finished redecorating the vault with Zara-flavored protein paste. What they hadn't expected was for her to walk out looking like she'd spent the afternoon doing moderately strenuous yard work, casually towing a trophy that weighed roughly 3 times what she did. The silence stretched until it became a living thing with its own gravitational field. So Zara said conversationally, dropping the king's head with a wet thud that echoed through the chamber, "Turns out your simulations are a lot more realistic than advertised. Someone might want to update the safety protocols." Commander Vex's crystalline form had gone completely transparent, which Zara had learned meant he was experiencing the equivalent of a system crash. Professor Gorth's tentacles had tied themselves into what looked like a reef knot, and his translator was emitting a steady stream of what sounded like extremely creative profanity in 17 different languages. Captain Reek had simply stopped buzzing entirely, his compound eyes fixed on the severed head like it might suddenly spring back to life and resume eating people. "Is that," one of the students whispered, "is that actually the Apex King?" Zara glanced back at her trophy. "Unless you guys have more than one 12-foot-tall murder machine with anger issues, yeah, that's him. Was him. Whatever." The crowd parted like she was carrying something contagious, which, considering the circumstances, she probably was. Cadet Knox, Commander Vex finally managed, his voice having developed a distinctly mechanical quality. "What exactly happened in there?" Zara shrugged. "Turns out your holographic simulations weren't particularly holographic. Met some interesting wildlife, had a few philosophical discussions about the nature of violence, did some interior decorating with explosives. You know, the usual." She looked around at the sea of faces, all of which were displaying various degrees of shock, terror, and what might have been religious awakening. "Oh, and I'm going to need someone to clean this up," she added, gesturing to the head. "It's starting to smell, and I've got a report to write about inadequate safety briefings and false advertising." By the next morning, word had spread through the academy like a particularly virulent case of gossip flu. The human had not only survived the vault, she'd conquered it. She'd turned the galaxy's most feared predator into a conversation piece, and walked out asking about dinner plans. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be Zara's friend. The same cadets who'd been placing bets on her demise were now asking if she wanted to form study groups. Professors who'd spent 3 years explaining basic concepts to her, like she was developmentally challenged, were suddenly very interested in her thoughts on advanced tactical theory. Cadet Knox, Professor Gorth approached her during lunch, his tentacles writhing in what she'd learned meant nervous excitement. "I was wondering if you might be interested in helping with a research project on unconventional warfare techniques." Zara looked up from her meal, which was the same unidentifiable protein paste she'd been eating for 3 years, though now it somehow tasted less like despair. "Let me guess," she said dryly, "you want to study primitive human tactics." "Well, yes, but we're thinking of rebranding them as innovative strategic applications." Before Zara could respond, her communicator chirped with an incoming message from Galactic Command. She read it quickly, her expression shifting from mild amusement to outright disbelief. "Something wrong?" Professor Gorth inquired. Zara held up the communicator. "Galactic Command wants to know if Earth would be interested in providing Special Forces training for their elite units. Apparently, they've suddenly realized that humans might have some useful skills after all." She stood up, gathering her tray. Funny how quickly adorably primitive becomes innovative strategic thinking when you need someone to kill things that everyone else is afraid of. That evening, Zara sat in her quarters, staring at a communication screen that showed the familiar blue and green marble of Earth hanging in the void like a cosmic marble that had rolled under the universe's couch. Her mother's face appeared on the screen, looking exactly the way mothers everywhere looked when their children called home from college, mildly concerned and completely unprepared for whatever they were about to hear. "Zara, honey, how was school?" Zara considered her response. "How did you explain to your mother that you'd spent the day being hunted by creatures that made Earth's most dangerous predators look like slightly aggressive house cats? How did you mention that you'd accidentally become the first human to kill an Apex King in single combat? and that the Galactic Military was now very interested in conscripting your entire species? It was fine, Mom. Had my final exam today. That's nice, dear. How did it go? Zara glanced over at the corner of her quarters, where the Apex King's head was mounted on the wall, like a particularly exotic hunting trophy. The Academy had let her keep it after she'd mentioned that refusing would constitute theft of personal property, and humans took property rights very seriously. I passed. Of course you did, sweetheart. We never had any doubt. Your father says to tell you he's proud of you. Tell him I said thanks. Zara paused, choosing her words carefully. Mom, you know how humans are kind of the new kids in galactic society? Yes, dear. Very intimidating. All those advanced civilizations. Right. Well, it turns out we might not be as behind the curve as everyone thought. Her mother's image flickered slightly as the long-distance communication struggled with the stellar interference. What do you mean, honey? Zara looked at the king's head again, then back at her mother's concerned face. Let's just say that being raised by the species that domesticated wolves and turned tigers into circus acts has some advantages when it comes to dealing with hostile alien wildlife. That's nice, dear. Are you eating enough? You look thin. Some things, Zara reflected, were universal constants. Mothers would worry about your eating habits whether you were facing college finals or literal apex predators. I'm eating fine, Mom. Listen, I might be getting some job offers soon. The Galactic Military is apparently very interested in human tactical approaches. Military? Zara, I don't want you doing anything dangerous. Zara bit back the urge to laugh. Dangerous? She'd just spent 8 hours in a vault with creatures that had been specifically designed to kill trained soldiers, armed with nothing but improvised weapons, and 3 years of barely controlled frustration. Instead, she smiled. Don't worry, Mom. Turns out humans are really good at this stuff. We've been practicing for millennia. After she ended the call, Zara sat back and considered the day's events. Tomorrow, she'd graduate at the top of her class. Next week, she'd probably be fielding job offers from military organizations that had spent decades convinced that humans were too primitive to be effective soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same species that had spent their entire evolutionary history turning apex predators into pets, meals, and entertainment was now being recruited to deal with apex predators that everyone else was afraid of. She looked at the king's head one more time, then opened her personal computer and began typing. Personal log. Zara Knox, Galactic Military Academy graduate. Note to Earth Central Command. Recommend immediate expansion of off-world military recruitment programs. Turns out the galaxy is full of things that need killing, and nobody else seems to know how to do it properly. Also, does anyone know where I can get a decent burger in this galaxy? The protein paste here tastes like sadness, and I've got a craving for something that used to have a face. She paused, then added a final line. P.S. Mom was right about the food. I am getting thin. Note to self, alien cuisine is definitely not worth the cultural exchange program. Outside her window, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blissfully unaware that the galaxy's newest apex predator had just asked her mom about care packages and complained about cafeteria food. It was, Zara decided, a perfectly normal Tuesday for a human being. Even if Tuesday happened to include decapitating legendary monsters and accidentally becoming the most feared cadet in galactic military history. She'd have to remember to mention that in her next call home. Right after she figured out how to explain the trophy on her wall.